we're talking about, I mean, the panel title, as you said, was about the future of European security, where there's going to be forged through diplomacy or conflict. I see problems either way, because this isn't simply a strategic or a technical question, it's a civilizational one. Because security at its root flows from identity. And Europe, as we all know, is suffering from a severe identity crisis of historical proportions. A continent that once defined itself through faith, family, tradition, nationhood, and had a strong sense of civilizational self-confidence, now increasingly rejects its past wholesale and defines itself through bureaucracy, submission to technocratic elites, and a hollowed-out, soulless version of so-called quote-unquote democracy that censors dissent and punishes independent thought, and kicks people out of borders, as we saw yesterday. So a continent that has lost confidence in itself, first of all, cannot defend itself. Secondly, it also can't organize a unified diplomatic strategy that's worth anything. And yet we're entering an age where defense is no longer optional. The geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting underneath our feet rapidly. The global order is quickly taking on a new form. I'm a historian, for those of you that know me, and we're seeing a revenge of history right now. History is returning, and I don't mean the soft sort of history that we see talked about in boardrooms in Paris, Berlin, Brussels, London, and the State Department for that matter. But we see a history full of chaos, conflict, and clashing powers. The war in Ukraine has exposed not just Russian aggression, but Europe's deep dysfunction as well. For generations, European leaders have hidden behind American military might while cutting their own defense budgets and growing their welfare states. Now, as the US under President Trump rightly reevaluates its global commitments and demands fairness of its allies, Europe is being asked to finally step up. I've written a lot about this. If any of you that have read about the history of American leadership and attitudes towards a transatlantic relationship, you may know that ever since Dwight Eisenhower was president, from the very beginning of NATO, American leaders have criticized Europe's lack of a proportional commitment to the collective defense. Eisenhower actually said things that are absolutely unprintable, as did Kennedy, as did Johnson, as did every president since then, and many American congressional leaders as well. Europe just isn't ready to step up. As one of my colleagues said, it would take at least 30 years if Europe was going to create a European army, and that's if it could come to any unified vision of what they're defending. Between 1990, just give you a few data points, between 1990, the end of the Cold War, which Mr. Van Orden so eloquently discussed, he was in that meeting in December 91 when the Soviet Union imploded, between that point in time and 2020, Europe's main battle tank fleet declined by 85%. Armored vehicles declined by 64%, artillery by 56%. Even Germany, the so-called economic engine of Europe, can barely today field a single fully operational armored brigade. While there are a few bright spots, such as Poland, which one of my panelists rightly praised, it is no secret that decades of underinvestment, complacency of dependence on Washington, have left the European continent militarily hollow. Perhaps worse still, Europe is politically and culturally fragmented, which has contributed, along with widely divergent threat perceptions, to strategic cacophony. Cacophony meaning nobody agrees on anything. The noise is just echoing out there and there's no unified voice. What does France see as the primary threat? What about Poland, Italy, Spain, Hungary, Germany, the Baltic states? Everyone has a different answer. There's no single vision, no shared doctrine, no unified command, only competing agendas shaped by wildly different values and interests. Brussels talks of strategic autonomy, as does Emmanuel Macron, but has no idea what it means, let alone how to build it. This isn't merely a failure of policy, it's a failure of conviction. How can a continent that censors dissenting voices, silences conservative values, and calls its own cultural heritage a source of shame, find the courage and self-confidence to face down Russia or anyone else for that matter? Diplomacy and deterrence only work when you know who you are, what you stand for, and what you're not willing to surrender. If Europe can't define itself, then how can it defend itself? Now let's talk about Ukraine for a second. The people of Ukraine have suffered greatly, and Russia's invasion has needed to be opposed. But diplomacy also requires realism, and realism in turn requires compromise. President Trump understands that, but he has not been met with cooperation, but rather confrontation by Kiev and Moscow, and undermining from Western European leaders who seem to be more intent on prolonging the war for their own purposes than in pursuing peace. So let's remember that war is a failure of statecraft. So we're seeing a failure of statecraft all the way around here in the European continent, as well as from the United States in the last few years. If Europe is serious about peace, it must return to the fundamentals of real diplomacy, which means hard truths and compromise, not merely moral posturing. The road ahead is not going to be easy. America may not always be there to defend Europe. As a strong transatlanticist, I hope that that's the case, but we can't depend on that. Europe has to do the hard work of rebuilding its own capabilities, and that does mean dramatically increasing real defense spending, but it also means the cultural and civilizational renewal that gives defense meaning. Europe must once again begin to believe in itself. But we must also recognize that new opportunity that this historic moment brings. As the old global structures break down, space opens up, especially for medium and smaller nations, to choose their own paths, to reclaim sovereignty, to reassert their identities historically, and to build a security order that's rooted in not supranational abstraction, but in reality and in their own values. In tradition, nationhood, and something tangible that citizens of the various European states can come together and believe is worth defending. So, will Europe's future be defined by conflict or diplomacy, as the title of this panel says? I'd say that all depends. It depends on whether Europe continues down the path of elite-driven bureaucratic authoritarianism dressed up as democracy, or whether we revive the soul of Europe, return the power to the people, and build a future based on sovereignty, dignity, and truth. Diplomacy will only work when it's backed by strength, and strength only will emerge from unity. And real unity can only grow from shared values. Right now, despite what's said in Paris, Brussels, and Berlin, Europe is not united by shared values, quote unquote. Between disagreement over fundamental values, mistrust among the various governments and peoples within Europe, mistrust of much of the people of Europe, of their governing elites, widely divergent threat perspectives, the lack of economic strength necessary to rebuild military capacity from such an atrophied level, demographic decline, and a lack of basic civilizational self-confidence, Europe is in a tough spot that will mitigate against success in either building a new security architecture more independent to the United States if that becomes necessary, or in a successful statecraft that can successfully avoid the destructive shoals of military conflict that are already upon us. So Europe's big task right now, as I see it, is to rediscover the sources of its former achievements, to reinvigorate a respect for its own past while acknowledging its past failures, to become truly democratic, protecting its citizenship rights rather than the privileges of the ruling elites, whether those elites be in Minsk, Moscow, Kiev, Paris, Berlin, or Brussels, and at the same time to build a security architecture and pursue a realistic diplomatic strategy that brings stability to the continent once again, so that economic rebuilding can take place that allows European citizens to flourish and prosper, not just economically, but spiritually more importantly. As an American who believes that Europe is important to the future of the United States and the globe and still has much to offer the broader world, even if Europe is no longer the center around which American grand strategy revolves, I hope and pray that you all succeed, and I'll be here to work with you as you pursue that.